The great scholar of early Christianity, Henry Chadwick, declares that the history of Christian philosophy begins not with a Christian, but with a Jew, Philo of Alexandria. And we want to spend a little time thinking about who this Philo was and what he contributed to early Christian theology. Philo was an aristocratic, well-educated, and well-connected member of the Jewish community in Alexandria. Alexandria was perhaps the third or second largest city, most important city in the ancient world, home of a tremendous library and a center of learning and thought, also the home of the largest Jewish diaspora in the ancient world. Philo was a faithful, practicing Jew who made pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, who intervened on behalf of the Jews in Alexandria during the crisis of the year 38, when there were anti-Jewish pogroms in the city. And Philo has left us a massive body of writings, transmitted, not accidentally, by Christians. It was Christians who took up his writings, kept them, copied them, and the reason they survive is because they were so well loved by Christians. On the whole, his writings present themselves as if they are simply commentaries on the 5 books of Moses. Naturally, he read the books of Moses in the Greek, in the Septuagint, and he ascribed full credence to the legend of the Septuagint's inspired translation. In fact, he augments and elaborates this legend. Now, to our eyes, it looks like when Philo opens his Bible and he looks at Moses, what he really sees is Plato. And to explain what happens when he says he's making a straightforward interpretation of the books of Moses, and he claims that he finds in here the doctrine of the forms, the notion of God's being immutable, inexpressible, unknowable, we might be puzzled. After all, in the Pentateuch, in the books of Moses, as we read it, God's quite knowable. He introduces himself to Moses. He appears in a burning bush. In fact, God changes his mind. God forms Adam out of the ground. And so we're wondering how Philo, I think without any duplicity on his part, he reads every one of those words and says, ah, yes, a perfectly clear exposition of this or that Middle Platonic doctrine. To make sense of that, we have to step back a bit and give some context for Hellenistic Judaism. In general, this is a crash course in Hellenistic thought, but it's important to say a few things to set the stage. One is that there had been philosophical critiques of religious ideas, especially mythic ideas, as far back on Greek soil as the pre-Socratics. So already before Plato, we have Xenophanes ridiculing the idea that the gods look like human beings and that they commit adultery and do all the other things that you would read in the pages of Homer or Hesiod. And Plato, of course, comes out quite strongly in his Republic, as well as in the Gorgias, and other dialogues, and says, myth is harmful. These are terrible stories to tell young people. These are unworthy notions of the gods. Never mind that Plato also includes major myths in the Gorgias and in the Republic, myths of his own, but I think he views his own myths as moral and edifying. There will be justice, there will be reward for those who are virtuous, and punishment for those who are bad, and so on. Suffice it to say, this idea that the myths are unworthy of the gods is so thoroughly absorbed that the only way to salvage the great poets like Homer and Hesiod is to read them allegorically. And this is a method perfected by the Stoics, the most important of the Hellenistic philosophical schools. The Stoics took Homer and Hesiod and said, okay, sure, it talks about Zeus and Hera mating and having offspring and committing adultery and so on and so forth. And in each case, they simply say, now Zeus is akin to the Greek word zane, for life. So this must simply be a symbol for life. Hera is like the Greek word for air. So when Zeus and Hera come together, it must have something to do with how air gives life, and so on and so forth. And they give full allegorical interpretations of all the myths, thereby removing what was theologically offensive about them and discovering in them basically principles about physics, about philosophy, sometimes even about ethics. You can see that the underlying hunch that the different philosophical schools will share, and in fact what the Stoics and Plato share, is the idea that there must be one God or principle behind all of the different stories and behind all of the different current forms of religiosity. So there is some truth, and Plato and the Stoics, in a sense, for all their differences, agree on the truth. What they disagree about is whether Homer and Hesiod point to it. Plato would say Homer and Hesiod tell nonsense, therefore they're not true. The Stoics say, nah, we want to keep those poems, those stories, therefore we will read them differently. But they agree you need some version, some story worthy of the gods. The notion of oneness is an important outworking of Alexander the Great's having brought under one kingdom all these disparate peoples. Because when that happens, they realize, oh, you worship a God we've never heard of before, and you have a different cult, a different set of religious practices than we've ever seen. And you basically get the beginnings of what we would in today's world call religious studies, trying to explain comparative religion. What do these have in common? Ah, perhaps the God you call such and such is like this God of ours. I see how it works, and maybe this is why you do things differently. But the only reason you go in for explanations like that is a prior conviction that there is some one truth, and for all the differences in human conduct and human belief, there must be some truth behind it all, and you need a story that makes sense of why the Ethiopians have one notion of the gods and the Scythians have another. The idea of individual particularities being fully valid seemed absurd. Now, if we think about how Jews figure into that Hellenistic world, we can see that there's something a bit awkward. I'll put up here this sort of heading, Judaism versus Hellenism. This is a dichotomy you will encounter in the literature, usually only for people to disavow it, but it's worth starting with. The idea of Judaism versus Hellenism is that the Jews sit quite awkwardly in the Hellenistic world. After all, Judaism is about nothing if not about particularity. We are the one people of God. We have a particular law. God gave it to us. It's the best. The law is chock full of rules about incredibly particular things. Which animal you can eat, whether the animal does or does not chew the cud, whether it does or does not have a cloven hoof. One day is different from other days. Everything about the law suggests particularity of every aspect of the entire world. And obviously, the natural implication to draw is that if God gave us this law, and our law talks about peculiar things, the God of the universe must really care about particular things. Particular things matter. That is what would look like a straightforward Jewish response to what they find in their Bible. But under the sort of the pressure of Hellenism, if we want to speak of it this way, of the dominant culture, you find Jews in the Hellenistic period, and there's the time after the Alexander the Great, saying, well, I think God used particular things to teach about what really matters. I'll tease that out in a minute, but that's holding on to the hunch that, yes, God gave us our law, yes, we're the best people, but making a different verdict from this third premise. If God cares about things that really matter, then God must not literally mean all the particular things God ordains in Scripture. Let's tease this out once more with and put some names to different personalities who would fall in one of these two categories. If you say Scripture teaches the truth about God, Scripture depicts God anthropomorphically. God has a mighty right hand. God changes God's mind, and so on and so forth. On the one hand, you could just say, you know what, I guess I learned something about the God of the universe. God is in some ways anthropomorphic. Maybe God changes God's mind. Maybe God is a he. But a more Hellenistic Jew will say, hold the show. It's also blindingly obvious that God is not like a human being by any normal definition of God. Ergo, God must be speaking non-literally. Scripture must be speaking non-literally when it says God has a mighty right arm or God changes God's mind. And so if we wanted to sort of divide Judaism versus Hellenism, we can make a little schema like this, and we can say there are books that feel like Palestinian Judaism that embrace particularity as the truth of the matter. The Book of Jubilees or other sorts of writings, perhaps some of the texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Jubilees is a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, and so far from finding it an embarrassment that the God of the Bible is particular, they just say, I guess God speaks Hebrew. I guess that's the true language. I guess God keeps Sabbath, and we better really figure out which day Sabbath is. And, the angels are circumcised. Like, that's not a weird thing we Jews do. That's the normal form of humanity. Adam was created circumcised. Y'all are just weird versions of human. This is a sort of bold cultural move. So far from being embarrassed about particularity, you just embrace it and say, we are the universal. Y'all are defective. But our focus is on Hellenistic Judaism. And so we have things like the letter of Aristeas, telling the story of the translation of the Septuagint. We have Philo, who's our interest today. And the letter of Aristeas, in a lovely and memorable expression, is telling the story of these translators. And they've come down to Alexandria. They're meeting with the king and his court of philosophers. And they're saying, oh, yes, yes. And if I could do a good posh British accent, I would do it now. You need to picture them sitting around drinking sherry. And they're talking about their law. And they read some of the things about all the particularities. And they say, oh, now mind you, please don't take the contemptible view that Moses enacted this legislation because of an excessive preoccupation with mice and weasels. No. When Moses forbade us to eat weasels, clearly he was just pointing out that the weasel, as we all know, is an animal with a filthy mouth. And so Moses was telling us not to be talebearers. And they go right through every last animal, every last cloven hoof, chewing the cud, and they find some important lesson. Now, the letter of Aristeas and Philo are Jews, so this dichotomy, Judaism versus Hellenism, is an unacceptable dichotomy. What we really want to say is there is Hellenistic Judaism, and Philo falls squarely in the world of Hellenistic Judaism. Within this category of Hellenistic Judaism, there are lots of authors saying remarkable things. You can tell they like what they see in the best of Greek culture, but they also insist we are the best, and so they just say, you guys got it from Moses. Moses is the oldest. He's the one who invented the alphabet. He's the inventor of culture. A Jew named Artapanus goes so far as to say, I think Moses, when he was in Egypt, taught the Egyptians their animal religions. We have a Jew setting the story of the Exodus to tragic verse. And of course, we have the letter of Aristeas, insisting that the law is the most philosophical of all texts. Now, how is it going to handle the fact that, as it knows perfectly well, most men feel some curiosity about these passages dealing with food and drink and animals regarded as unclean? This is precisely what ancient Greeks and Romans comment on when they talk about the Jews. It's really weird that you people don't eat pork. It's really weird that you have all these distinctions. Well, Aristeas says all these regulations concerning what's permissible are set forth by way of allegory. It makes the same move the Stoics made with Hesiod and Homer and applies it to the text of Moses, which it adds is older than Hesiod or Homer. It's a great cultural slam dunk. You get to be universal and focus on things like the four cardinal virtues and truth about the one God, while in fact upholding your text as the oldest and best in a world that prized ancient texts. What's the letter of Aristeas going to do with bizarre things from the book of Leviticus, like animals that chew the cud and all this business? Chewing the cud. It's like regurgitating life and its subsistence. Moses gave us that as a lesson about memory, and so on and so forth. The letter of Aristeas goes right through and offers an allegorical message for each of the particular commandments. Now, this broad stream of Hellenistic Judaism is in some ways brought to fruition in Philo. Philo does some similar things to other Hellenistic Jews, but he also does some new things. In terms of the similar things, let's just look at Philo's insistence that here are sort of his core convictions. The world is in harmony with the law, that is our Jewish law, and the law is in harmony with the world. Therefore, the keeper of the law, that is all of our particular commandments, is a citizen of the world, living in accordance with nature. That last expression is the hallmark of ancient philosophical schools. The Stoics, the Cynics, and increasingly the other philosophical schools all insist the goal of life is to get away from mere opinion and foolishness and to live life in accordance with nature. And Philo says the way to do that is to read the books of Moses. He's going to achieve that by making an allegorical interpretation of the law, much along the lines of the letter of Aristeas, but he doesn't simply look for moral lessons. He's also going to look for metaphysical lessons. So as he writes his commentary, he's going to speak both about the literal meaning of expressions, but also their deeper meaning. When it comes time to speak about circumcision, he'll say, well, this means the excision of pleasure, which you can kind of understand how he would get at that. When he comes to resting on the Sabbath, he says, note that the Sabbath is the seventh day. And then he goes haywire with Pythagorean speculations about the various mysteries of the number 7. So he says, this is no mistake that God picked out this day as special. And yet, for as much as Philo is allegorical, he says, mind you, we still do follow the instruction of circumcision, and we do still observe the Sabbath, and we do still make distinctions between clean and unclean foods. He has a nice explanation of this. He says that observing the commandments is like the human body, and the inner meaning of the commandments is like the soul. Now, you can't neglect your body altogether without destroying the soul. So he says, if we keep and observe the laws, that is, we do them, we'll gain a deeper understanding of what it is that they symbolize. So Philo does not agree with really radically Hellenistic Jews who say, look, if circumcision just means excision of pleasure, can we just get rid of the rite and just stick with the lesson? He says, no, we do have to do it. I want to move on to some slightly headier moves on Philo's part and look at what the Bible looks like through his eyes. We turn to look at an example of Philo's exegesis, and we'll see how influential Plato's ideas are by thinking about one of Plato's most important dialogues, the Timaeus. The Timaeus is the dialogue most frequently commented upon in this period. That's part of the story of Middle Platonism, which we will take up shortly. But we can't understand Philo without a bit about Plato. So, as I'm sure you all recall, one of Plato's most seminal ideas is that of the forms, or in Greek, the ideas. That there's a realm of forms separate from the realm of matter and change. For Plato, primarily this serves an epistemological function. It's his effort to explain how, in this world where every light and horse and triangle and example of justice, where they all differ, how is it we know what justice is or a triangle is? He says, well, every version of a triangle, every version of justice somehow participates in an immaterial, unchanging ideal. So those are the forms. Now, something most Platonic scholars would say Plato never fully explains is how the forms relate to this world. Do things in this world participate in them? We don't have to solve that, but we will say that in the Timaeus, he says that the creation of the world took place when a craftsman, he uses the Greek word demiurge. Remember that word, it will figure in Gnosticism. Plato says that a craftsman did his best to look at the forms as if they were an architectural blueprint and to impose them into matter. matter already existed. Matter is eternal. And what the craftsman or creator God here did was try to get the forms of a horse or a light or a triangle into matter. Now, the reason justice is messed up and triangles are never perfect in this world is because matter was a recalcitrant medium in which for the demiurge to work. Plato presents this dialogue, the Timaeus, as a myth. It's called mythos, it's called a likely story, and part of what Platonists in this period would be worried about was what parts are literal, what parts are allegorical or mythical, or so on. What we want to look at is thinking about the massively influential power of this story. What is it happens when Philo reads Genesis 1 and 2? Well, Philo, of course, is going to replace a craftsman, lower deity, with the true God. But he doesn't want to imagine God looking at ideas that already exist. For Philo, the forms, the ideas, are thoughts in the mind of God. This is a major philosophical move. It's possible here Philo is following Antiochus of Ascalon, but be that as it may, this is a Middle Platonic innovation to say that the forms don't have this separate existence. They're mental. They're God's mental activity. And that means for Philo, and this is pretty neat, when he reads Genesis 1 and 2, as you will recall from an Old Testament class, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 have two separate creation stories. When Philo reads those two, he's going to say, aha, the first is the story of God creating the ideal, the form man. So Genesis 1 says, let us make humankind, male and female, he made it. That's Philo's version of the text. And Philo says, well, that was God not creating actual every Tom, Dick, and Harry that you see on the street. That was God creating the form, man. And notice that this initial form is androgynous, just as we would get in Plato's Symposium. Then you come to Genesis 2 and 3, and that's God actually creating a man from the dust of the ground in the realm of becoming. And from that man, God extracts a woman. You don't have two contradictory stories. You have God teaching a philosophical lesson about the creation of forms, followed by the creation of the physical world. Obviously, when we read Genesis 1 and 2, that is probably not what strikes us, but I would submit this isn't so different from what happens today if a Christian reads Genesis 1 and 2 and tries to line up the order of the creation with what science would tell us about what the oldest species are. So you may have someone today saying, aha, fish were created before birds, and indeed perhaps fish are evolutionarily older. For us, the dominant narrative is so strongly science that when you want to say the Bible's true, you read it in light of science. In Philo's day, Platonism was so thoroughly true that if you wanted to get the Bible to come out true, without even intending it, you read it against a Platonic background. I want to speak about one other contribution that Philo made that is perhaps the most important for early Christian theology. And to get at it, we have to start with a problem. The problem is that according to a standard Middle Platonic division, there is a physical world and there is an intellectual world, the world of forms. Humans exist in the physical world. God exists in the intellectual world, the world of forms. God is distant. And increasingly in Middle Platonism, and Philo is characteristic of this, God becomes further and further removed from the physical world. For Philo, God is unnameable, unknowable, inconceivable. God is simply being. Even the word God is some sort of approximation. Better just to say being. Now, you can see what the problem will be. If God is unnameable and unknowable and inconceivable, how can there be any how can there be any human cognition of God? How can Philo be writing about God? Philo solves this problem by speaking about the Logos. And for Philo, God's Logos is the bridge that links the ideas, the forms in the mind of God, and the forms in individual human minds. Philo does this a couple different ways. At one point in his questions and answers on Genesis, when he's speaking about God planting trees in Eden, he says, well, when God was planting, he planted the idea of trees in the most sovereign thing, the human soul. Therefore, rather than according to like a Platonic idea, where for humans to know something about the world of forms, they have to recollect it. It's the idea of remembrance. Because for Plato, humans began somehow, they once existed in this realm of the forms. For Philo, the possibility of knowing about the realm of the forms exists because God sovereignly set those forms in the human mind. And then, therefore, the link between God and this world is God's reason, God's Logos. That's God's intermediary. That's how a God utterly transcendent and separate is able to interact with the physical world. We'll say more about Logos shortly, but just to give some of the titles that Philo gives to the word Logos. He says Logos is a second God. He says it is God's firstborn. It is wisdom. Moses is one of God's logoi. That's the plural of Logos. Logos can be found in Torah. So the striking thing here is that this Logos can be spoken of in quasi-divine terms as God's Son. Now, you don't have to go looking very far to see how all the intellectual work Philo is doing to connect an unknowable God to the world of being and becoming, using Logos as the intermediary, how this is going to fit hand in glove with Christian thinking about Christ as the Logos of God. For Philo, when it comes to ethics, bear in mind that the goal is going to be ascent, because the human mind exists in a human body, in this physical world, a world distant from God. So the goal is going to be, first of all, a golden mean. He borrows that from Aristotle, although he discovers it in the book of Numbers, chapter 20. It's going to mean restraint of passionate desires, and above all, it's going to be an intellectual, spiritual, mystical ascent. The tools of this trade will be the careful study of Scripture with an eye for its deeper meaning. And this is among the things that Philo cedes to Christianity. The transmission of Philo into Christendom goes through the city of Alexandria, where major Christian thinkers such as Clement of Alexandria and Origen in the 2nd century read and use Philo. Clement and Origen cite him by name, and via Origen, who was massively influential through the 4th century. Through Origen, Philo is disseminated, the thought of Philo, even to people who don't always quote Philo. So for instance, in the Exegesis of Ambrose, you will find such extended sections of Philo that were you to submit that to an academic dean, the word plagiarism might come up. Philo is never cited, but exegetical after exegetical move of Philo is repeated. And in this sense, Philo is quite influential, so much so that he becomes a church father, honoris causa. How does that happen? Well, the legend ultimately grows up that Philo, so I'm quoting here the church historian Eusebius in the early 4th century, he says, yes, he knows that Philo was a Platonist and a Pythagorean, but he says, he was in Rome and he met St. Peter, and he got to know him, and he said, Peter, I love your work. And he went back to Egypt and he met Peter's secretary, Mark, and Philo, in his book, The Therapeutai, was writing about Christian monastics in Egypt. Well, this is not true. Philo was not writing about Christian monastics in Egypt, but it's interesting that the story would develop when Christians are reading Philo, they said, this is too good to be true. This guy must have known Christianity. Otherwise, how could he have had so much of the truth? Perhaps the most important things Philo gives to Christianity would include allegorical reading, which of course has an older heritage, the notion of the logos as the intermediary, which both makes knowledge of God possible and also makes God's interaction with this world possible. And although Philo is widely revered and embraced and very influential, there were critics. So Theodore of Mopsuestia, when he's arguing for a literal exegesis in Antioch, this is a part of the story we'll get to later, will say, why did Origen follow his exegesis on that of a Jew? So there are critical voices, but the influence of Philo on Christian interpretation and thinking is profound. We will pick up the story in the next lecture by looking more closely at the main trends in Middle Platonic thought. Philo is himself one character in Middle Platonism, and looking at how this idea of the logos gets picked up and developed by the earliest Christian philosophical thinkers.